The History of America, Chapter 1. Before the footsteps, long ago, before any footprint pressed into its soil, a vast and wild continent stretched quietly beneath the endless skies. It was a land older than memory, sculpted by mountains that soared like frozen waves, rivers that carved deep paths through valleys, and forests that whispered in ancient tongues. From the icy peaks of the north to the misty shores of the south, life pulsed in every corner. Great herds of mammoths lumbered across open plains, their curved tusks catching the golden light of the sun. Saber-toothed cats, silent and watchful, stalked in the tall grasses. Towering trees, some as wide as houses, formed endless canopies. Their roots threading deep into the patient earth, each dawn brought a soft symphony, the low rumble of distant waterfalls, the rustling dance of leaves in the breeze, the cry of eagles circling high above. Seasons moved in a steady rhythm, painting the land with the blush of spring flowers, the heavy green of summer forests, the fire of autumn leaves, and the deep silence of winter snows. Beneath the soil, seeds waited. In the rivers, fish darted. In silver flashes. In the air, the scent of pine and wildflowers drifted freely. It was a continent alive but untouched, holding its breath through the ages, as if waiting for a story yet to unfold, a story written not by the forces of nature alone, but by the steps of humanity. The first peoples arrive across a bridge of ice that once linked two distant worlds. The first travelers came. They were small groups at first, families, hunters, wanderers drawn by the slow pull of hope and hunger, curiosity and need. The land bridge, now vanished beneath cold waters, had been a frozen highway between continents, a narrow ribbon of survival stretched across the ends of the earth. They came on foot, wrapped in furs, their footsteps crunching against the frozen ground. Behind them stretched endless miles of frozen tundra. Ahead, a land unknown and unseen. Every step forward was a step into mystery. They carried few possessions, sharp-edged tools, woven blankets, the fire that lit their camps, but inside them they carried stories, songs, and the unspoken dreams of a future not yet imagined. As they moved southward, the ice began to loosen its grip. Valleys opened, rivers roared to life, forests unfurled like green banners. The first peoples spread slowly, exploring the endless breadth of this new world. They found oceans that seemed to touch the sky, deserts painted in red and gold, mountains that split the heavens. Each new landscape asked something different of them: courage, adaptation, respect. Generations passed. Footsteps became paths, and paths became trails winding through forests, crossing mountains, tracing riverbeds. Over time, the great web of humanity was spun across the continent, tying distant peoples together in invisible threads of shared existence. They did not conquer the land, they became part of it, like stones in a river, shaped and smoothed by the steady current of time. Civilizations in harmony as centuries turned into millennia. The first scattered groups grew into cultures rich with knowledge and wonder. In the valleys of the Mississippi, people raised great earthen mounds, shaping the land itself into places of ceremony and gathering. These mounds, shaped like serpents and birds, were not just monuments, they were prayers written in soil and stone, meant to touch the sky, far to the west, among cliffs of sun-baked stone. The ancestral Pueblones carved their homes directly into the canyon walls. Their villages clung to the cliffs like nests, each doorway framed by centuries of sun and silence. Above, the sky stretched so wide and blue it seemed almost to hum. Below, the earth cracked open into canyons where rivers whispered their ancient songs. Across the vast plains, nomadic cultures followed the thundering herds of bison, weaving their lives into the rhythms of the great migrations. In the dense forests of the Northeast, confederacies of nations formed, creating systems of governance that balanced individual freedom with the needs of the many. Art, music, and craftsmanship flourished. Pottery carried stories and swirling patterns of clay and color. Woven baskets held not just food, but the memory of generations. Songs drifted on the wind, rising from firesides and ceremonies, carrying the voices of those who knew that every tree, every river, every mountain was alive, watching, and sacred. Civilizations rose and adapted, each tuned carefully to the landscapes they called home. No two were the same, yet all shared a quiet understanding. The earth was not theirs to possess, but theirs to honor, sacred bonds with the land. For the first peoples of America, the land was not merely ground to be walked upon. It was a living spirit, a sacred relative, a storyteller older than time. Every river was a vein of life, every mountain a memory. Trees were not timber waiting to be cut, but grandfathers rooted deep in wisdom. The winds were the voices of ancestors, speaking in the rustle of leaves, the howl across the plains, the hush of snowfall. Their languages were laced with reverence. Words for water, sky, and stone carried layers of meaning. Survival, beauty, respect. Ceremonies honored the changing seasons, giving thanks for the gift of life renewed with each turn of the sun. Songs rose in praise of rain and harvest. Prayers were whispered to the spirits of the hunt, and dances stamped gratitude into the earth itself. Children grew up hearing stories that taught not domination, but kinship. A bear was a teacher of strength. A salmon, a lesson in persistence. A cedar tree, a giver of shelter and medicine. Every act of daily life, from planting seeds to weaving blankets to carving canoes, was a conversation with the land, a dialogue that stretched back through generations unseen. Even death was not an end, but a return, a giving back of the body to the soil that had nurtured it, a final gesture of belonging. Graves were often simple, unmarked, blending into the earth as naturally as fallen leaves, allowing the land to hold its children close once more. This was not a fragile peace, but a robust, enduring relationship, a living, breathing understanding that humans were but one thread in the grand tapestry of life. And so, as the centuries stretched long and the seasons turned, the continent remained alive in a different way, not untouched anymore, but touched gently, with care and reverence, long before the ships crossed the ocean and foreign flags pierced the soil, long before cities rose and borders were drawn. There was a time when the land and its people moved together, like dancers in an endless waltz, a time when America was not a nation, but a living song, sung in harmony with the wind, the waters, and the stars. Chapter 2. Whispers across the ocean. The winds shifted over Europe, carrying more than the scent of salt, and sea. They carried dreams heavy, golden dreams into the hearts of sailors, merchants, and kings. As the Middle Ages drew to a slow, aching close, the people of Europe grew restless. Their maps, once filled with dragons and warnings of "here be monsters," began to feel small, incomplete, and unbearably confining. For centuries, much of the world beyond Europe remained shrouded in myth and mist. Stories trickled back from distant travelers' tales of strange lands across endless waters, of spices that could heal or flavor, of treasures that could lift kingdoms from poverty to splendor. These whispers fanned the flames of ambition, making the oceans less a boundary and more an invitation. Portugal stood at the forefront, her tiny fleets clinging to the coastlines of Africa, inching southward with cautious hope. Spain, watching with jealous eyes, soon followed. Their ships grew sturdier, their navigators braver, their rulers more willing to risk fortunes for the chance at untold riches. By the late 1400s, the mood across Europe was electric. The invention of the printing press allowed news, maps, and rumors to spread faster than ever before. Compasses and new ship designs, like the nimble caravel, gave sailors a sliver more confidence to push beyond familiar shores. And as the Ottoman Empire tightened its grip on land routes to Asia, the sea, vast, frightening, and free, beckoned with the promise of new paths and new power. In royal courts and taverns alike, the talk was of voyages and glory. The old world, once comfortable in its known borders, had become too small for the dreams of men who longed for something more. The age of exploration had begun not with a roar, but with a whisper that grew louder with every breaking wave. Myth and gold. Hope is a strange navigator. It charts courses not with reason, but with yearning. And in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, hope was heavily gilded with gold across Europe. Stories of fabulous cities spread like wildfire. El Dorado, the city of gold, hidden deep within uncharted lands. Cibola, the 7 cities of shimmering wealth. Ancient rumors, woven with truth and fantasy, promised that unimaginable riches lay just beyond the horizon, if only one were daring enough to find them. Men like Christopher Columbus sailed not simply for the love of the ocean, but because they believed or hoped that treasures beyond comprehension awaited. His 1492 voyage, supported by Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, was meant to reach the riches of Asia by a daring western route. Instead, he stumbled upon a landmass that would rewrite the maps of the world forever. In the decades that followed, others followed the path of adventure and ambition. Hearn and Court arrived in the land of the Aztecs, drawn by tales of Montezuma's hoards of gold. Francisco Pizarro set his sights on the mighty Incan Empire in South America, seduced by visions of temples lined with golden walls. Every lush jungle, every winding river, seemed to whisper of treasures just out of reach, yet the greatest myth was not just the gold itself, but the belief that it could be taken without consequence, that these lands were empty prizes waiting for those bold enough to seize them. European explorers saw the New World as a glittering mirror, reflecting their dreams, their fears, and their deepest hungers. Few paused to wonder about the people who already called those lands home, living lives rich in culture, history, and meaning treasures of a different kind, unseen by greedy eyes, and so, driven by myths they barely understood, thousands set sail. They crossed oceans wider than any they had ever dared imagine, carried by winds of ambition, and guided by dreams of gleaming fortunes. Contact and consequence the first meetings between European explorers and the native peoples of the Americas were moments heavy with wonder and dread. Two worlds, separated for tens of thousands of years, collided with a force that neither could truly comprehend. At first, there was awe. European sailors marveled at lush forests, towering mountains, and rivers teeming with life. Native tribes, in turn, regarded the strangers with wary fascination, their strange ships and metal armor unlike anything they had ever seen. Gifts were exchanged: beads, trinkets, food, and knowledge and gestures of tentative curiosity. But beneath the surface, trouble brewed. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and deeply different worldviews made mistrust inevitable. Europeans saw the land as something to claim, to tame, and to transform. Many native peoples who lived in deep harmony with the earth could not fathom the idea of ownership in the European sense. The consequences of these meetings were swift and brutal. Conquistadors like Cortes and Pizarro did not arrive as guests, but as conquerors. Their small forces, armed with steel, gunpowder, and ruthless ambition, toppled mighty empires that had stood for centuries. The Aztec and Incan civilizations, among the most sophisticated the world had ever seen, crumbled under the weight of foreign greed and violence. Even when intentions were less openly violent, the presence of Europeans unleashed forces beyond control. Societies were upended. Traditional ways of life were shattered. Ancient knowledge, art, and languages began to vanish under the tide of conquest. The Americas were forever changed. And so, too, was Europe. Gold and silver flooded back across the Atlantic, reshaping economies and fueling centuries of conflict and colonization. Ideas, plants, animals, and people moved between the continents in a vast, complicated exchange that would reshape the very fabric of life on Earth. What had started as exploration had become something else entirely, a transformation born not of mutual discovery, but of collision. Invisible enemies, the sharpest sword often goes unseen. As ships sailed back and forth across the Atlantic, they carried more than men and metals. They carried invisible passengers, diseases for which the native peoples of the Americas had no defenses: smallpox, measles, influenza, simple words, devastating forces. These illnesses, long familiar to crowded European cities, spread like wildfire through native populations who had never been exposed to them. Without any natural immunity, entire villages, tribes, and civilizations crumbled under the weight of these unseen invaders. The death toll was staggering. In some areas, up to 90% of the indigenous population perished within mere decades of first contact. Whole cultures disappeared almost overnight, leaving behind silent fields, abandoned cities, and empty trails. The sorrow was immeasurable. Elders who held the histories of their people, artisans who shaped sacred objects, leaders who guided their nations, all fell. Survivors faced the overwhelming task of preserving what they could, mourning what was lost, and adapting to a world That had changed beyond recognition. For many native peoples, the arrival of Europeans must have seemed less like an invasion of soldiers and more like a terrible, unstoppable curse. The diseases did not distinguish between warrior and child, between king and commoner. They moved silently and swiftly, leaving only grief in their wake. And so, before most wars were fought, before treaties were broken, before settlers laid claim to land that was not theirs, the battle had already been lost by many. The New World had been scarred not just by swords and greed, but by breath, by touch, by a death that came quietly and left nothing untouched. Chapter 3: The Struggle to Settle. The first failed colonies long before America was a name known across the world. It was a mystery. A place of wild beauty, deep forests, and endless coastlines. To European eyes, it was a land of promise, but also a land that refused to yield its secrets easily. The first attempts to settle here were filled with hope. And heartbreak died in 1585. The English planted their first fragile hope on the shores of Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Led by Sir Walter Raleigh's vision, a small group of settlers arrived, believing they could carve a foothold out of the wilderness. They built simple structures, watched the ocean for familiar sails, and waited for more supplies, but the land was harsher than they imagined. Crops failed. Relations with local Native American tribes, tense and delicate, sometimes frayed beyond repair. When a resupply mission finally returned years later, what they found chilled them to the bone. The colony had vanished. No bodies, no survivors. Only a single word carved into a weathered post. Croatan historians still debate what happened. Were the settlers absorbed into nearby tribes? Did they attempt a desperate journey elsewhere? Or did something darker claim them? The failure of Roanoke haunted English dreams of colonization. It was a stark reminder that the New World was not a blank canvas waiting for European brushstrokes. It was a living land, full of challenges they did not yet understand. Still, despite the fear and the failures, the dream did not die. It simply waited, biding its time, whispering to the hearts of the hopeful and the desperate across the sea. Plymouth's fragile promise in 1620, a battered ship named the Mayflower arrived on the icy shores of what is now Massachusetts. Aboard were the Pilgrims' men, women, and children seeking a new beginning, where they could worship freely, far from the heavy hand of England's kings. Their first sight of the New World was not welcoming. It was cold, unforgiving. Trees loomed dark against the gray skies. Winter had already set its teeth into the land, yet despite the cold, despite the fear, they stayed on board the Mayflower. Before setting foot on land, they signed an agreement, the Mayflower Compact, a simple, solemn promise to govern themselves together with fairness and unity. In the raw wilderness, it was more than a document. It was a lifeline, a quiet vow to hold on to civilization even when surrounded by uncertainty. The first winter was brutal. Half the settlers died from disease, starvation, and exposure. Every grave dug into the frozen earth must have felt like the New World itself rejecting them. Yet, those who survived did not abandon their dream. They planted new crops. They built rough shelters. They leaned on each other. The Wampanoag people, native to the region, played a vital role in their survival. Leaders like Massasoit extended cautious hands of friendship, teaching the newcomers how to fish, plant corn, and live with the rhythms of the land. In the autumn of 1621, after months of struggle and heartbreak. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag shared a harvest feast, a fragile promise of peace, a glimmer of hope that two very different peoples could coexist, even if only for a time. Plymouth's survival was not a triumph of strength, but of stubborn, trembling hope, the kind that clings to frozen ground and refuses to let go. Survival and conflict as more settlers arrived, drawn by the same dreams of land and freedom. Survival became a daily struggle, not just against nature, but against themselves and each other. Food was always at the heart of their troubles. Early settlements often lacked experienced farmers. Crops failed under unfamiliar skies. Fishing and hunting helped, but never seemed enough. Famine haunted the young colonies like a silent, persistent shadow. Faith, too, became both a source of strength and a spark for friction. Different groups carried different visions of what a pure life looked like. In Massachusetts, Puritans sought to build a society deeply rooted in religious discipline. Dissenters, those who challenged the strict rules, often found themselves cast out into the wilderness, forced to found new colonies where they could worship in their own ways. Even within the settlements, tensions simmered. Class divisions from the old world found their way into the new. Leaders emerged, some fair, others harsh. Laws were passed, punishments enforced. The dream of a fresh start often collided with the old instincts of fear, pride, and control. And then there was the matter of the land itself. Native American tribes, who had lived and thrived on this continent for thousands of years, were not passive observers. At first, some tribes extended fragile alliances, trading goods and knowledge. But as more settlers arrived, pressing further inland, building fences and clearing forests, the balance shifted, skirmishes erupted. Misunderstandings turned to violence. Fear hardened into hatred. The early years of American settlement were marked by as much conflict as cooperation, a painful reminder that two worlds could not overlap without deep, lasting scars. Survival meant more than building homes and planting crops. It meant navigating a fragile, often dangerous web of human pride, need, and misunderstanding, a lesson learned painfully. Again and again, the seeds of permanence among the earliest flickers of lasting settlement was Jamestown, founded in 1607 in the swampy lands of Virginia. Like Roanoke before it, Jamestown teetered on the edge of collapse more than once. Disease, starvation, and conflict decimated its people. During the brutal, starving time of 1609 to 1610, colonists were reduced to desperate measures, with only a handful surviving the bitter winter. Yet somehow Jamestown endured. One of the reasons was the introduction of tobacco. John Rolfe, a settler with a keen sense of opportunity, cultivated a sweeter strain of the plant that quickly became prized back in Europe. Tobacco fields spread like wildfire, binding the colony's survival to the fortunes of a single, demanding crop. This newfound wealth came at a steep cost. The demand for labor fueled the beginnings of a system that would shape America's darkest chapters. the importation of enslaved Africans, torn from their homes to work the fields of a land not their own. Jamestown was not the only settlement to take root. Gradually, others grew along the eastern seaboard in Maryland, in the Carolinas, in New Netherland, which would later become New York. Each struggled in its own way. Each bore the weight of survival, of compromise, of conflict, these early colonies laid the rough, uneven foundations of what would one day be called America. Not through grand victories, but through a slow, painful accumulation of tiny triumphs and terrible losses. Fences were raised. Fields were plowed. Rivers were crossed. Alliances were made and broken. Every stone laid, every crop harvested, every painful compromise whispered one simple, stubborn truth. We are still here. The seeds of permanence were not sown in glory or ease. They were planted in hardship, watered with hope, and left to root themselves deep into the soil of a complex, contested land. As one century began to close and another waited just beyond the horizon, the story of America was still young raw, uncertain and fragile as a newborn foal, yet already pulsing with a life that refused to be snuffed out. Chapter 4. A new world takes root. In the first uncertain decades of settlement, survival was not enough. To stay, to grow, the colonies needed lifeblood, the steady pulse of trade, the nourishment of an economy strong enough to anchor dreams. Into the soil, tobacco rose first, tall and golden, bending in the humid breezes of Virginia's fields. John Rolfe's crop, sweeter than any the English had tasted, spread like a wildfire across the colonies. Tobacco became more than a plant. It was a currency, a measure of wealth, a reason to claim more land and demand more labor. Every seed pressed into the earth bound the colonies tighter to the rhythms of a new economy. Farther north, fur became the prize. Thick beaver pelts and other animal skins fetched high prices in Europe, where soft fur symbolized wealth and status. Trappers and traders, both European and Native American, threaded rivers and forests in search of animals to feed the hunger of distant markets. The fur trade built fragile bridges between cultures, alliances, agreements, and, too often, betrayals. Fishing and timber, farming and trade, each played their part. Colonies became small engines of production, feeding the needs of empires. Across the sea, crops filled cargo holds. Timber built ships. Fur lined the coats of kings and queens, but survival was never simple. Droughts came. Crops failed. Winters bit hard. Trade routes were long and perilous. Pirates haunted the coastlines, and hostile forces, both human and nature, threatened to undo what had been so carefully built. Every harvest, every pelt, every barrel of fish was a small, stubborn victory against a land that asked much and gave little. Through it all, a quiet transformation was underway. These were no longer mere outposts clinging to survival. Slowly, they were becoming something more. Communities with roots deepening in strange, stubborn soil. The slave ships arrive, but not all labor was free. Along with goods and hopes, another. Cargo crossed the Atlantic. Human lives, bound in chains. In 1619, the first recorded ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived at Point Comfort in Virginia. It would not be the last. As tobacco fields expanded and fortunes grew, so too did the demand for labor brutal, endless labor. The transatlantic slave trade was a system built on cruelty and greed. Men, women, and children were torn from their homes in Africa, marched to coastal forts, and packed into ships under conditions so inhuman that many did not survive the journey. Those who did faced a life of bondage, stripped of freedom, identity, and often hope. The impact was devastating beyond words. Entire African communities were hollowed out. Generations were lost. Cultures were fractured. Across the Atlantic, the colonies began to build their wealth upon the backs of those who had no voice, no rights, and no escape. Plantations grew. Fortunes swelled. And slowly, chains wrapped not just around the wrists of the enslaved, but around the very soul of the young colonies. Even those who did not own slaves were shaped by the world's slavery created by the goods it produced, the wealth it generated, the brutal inequalities it hardened into daily life. The arrival of the first slave ships was more than a moment. It was the opening of a wound that would shape the American story for centuries to come, a wound still tender, still aching beneath the surface. Amid the rising hopes of the New World, the darkest roots were already taking hold, twisting deep into the soil. Religious refugees in the uneasy world of the colonies, faith offered both refuge and division. Many settlers had fled Europe, not for gold or land, but for the chance to worship freely, to build communities shaped by belief rather than by royal decree. Puritans, seeking to purify the Church of England, founded settlements in Massachusetts Bay. Their vision was strict, their rules harsh. Life was to be lived according to Scripture, and those who strayed risked exile or worse. Yet not all hearts beat to the same rhythm. In time, dissenters splintered away. Roger Williams, advocating for true religious freedom and fair treatment of Native Americans, founded Rhode Island, a small beacon for outcasts and dreamers. And Hutchinson, questioning the rigid doctrines of the Puritan leaders, was cast out, carrying her courage into the wilderness. In Maryland, Catholics found a home. In Pennsylvania, Quakers led by William Penn carved out a refuge of tolerance and peace, welcoming persecuted peoples from across Europe. Each new settlement wove its own pattern of belief into the tapestry of colonial life. Churches rose beside town halls. Sermons echoed over rivers and fields. Faith shaped laws, communities, even the rhythms of daily labor, but with faith also came friction. Colonists brought with them the old divisions of Europe between Protestant and Catholic, Puritan and Quaker, Anglican and Anabaptist. Arguments turned to feuds. Tolerance, though celebrated by some, remained rare and fragile. Still, through the dust of argument and the fires of passion, a radical idea began to take root. That belief, though powerful, might not need to be enforced by the state. That the soul could be free even when the body was bound to the laws of a shared society. It was an idea that would, one day, grow into one of America's defining dreams. New identities born as years turned to decades. The people of the colonies began to change, not all at once, but slowly, steadily, like a tide reshaping the shoreline. Europe remained their past, but it no longer defined their present. Children were born who had never seen England, France, or Holland. They knew only the forests and fields of the New World. Their accents shifted. Their food changed. Their customs, once imported like precious goods, began to adapt to the rugged. Realities around them, a farmer in Virginia, planting tobacco, had little in common with a fisherman in Massachusetts or a fur trader in New Netherland. Yet they shared something deeper, a sense of separation, of difference, from the distant powers that still claimed to rule them. The hard lessons of survival taught self-reliance. The endless distance from kings and parliaments taught independence. Of thought. The varied landscapes from swampy deltas to rocky coasts to endless forest-shaped spirits that were flexible, stubborn, and fiercely proud, native peoples, too, continued to shape the colonial world, though their voices and influence were often pushed to the margins. Trade, conflict, alliances, and shared knowledge left indelible marks on colonial cultures, even as expansion and disease devastated indigenous nations. A new identity was taking form, not wholly European, not wholly native, but something else. Colonial, and yet something more. They did not yet call themselves Americans. That name still lay beyond the horizon. But in their stubbornness, their dreams, their conflicts, and their communities, the people of the colonies were becoming something new, the first faint outlines of a people who would one day call a continent their own. The New World was no longer a distant dream. It was home. Chapter 5. Cracks in the foundation. In the still air of colonial streets, something unseen began to shift, a low stirring, like the first tremors of a distant storm. For generations, the settlers had lived under the distant shadow of a king, across the sea. But now the crown's reach was growing longer, and its hunger for gold heavier. The cost of empire had risen. Wars fought across oceans, particularly the costly 7 Years' War, had drained Britain's coffers. To refill them, Parliament turned its gaze toward the colonies. They reasoned that those who had benefited from British protection should now help bear the cost. New taxes followed swiftly. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, paper, paint, glass, tea, once simple goods, now carried hidden weight. Coins grew scarce, resentment grew thick. For many colonists, these taxes felt less like a fair request and more like a heavy hand closing around their throats. What rankled even more deeply was the lack of voice. No colonial representatives sat in Parliament. Decisions that shaped their daily lives were made an ocean away without their consent. The Old English cry, no taxation without representation, found new breath in colonial mouths. To the British Crown, the taxes were practical, even fair. To the colonists, they were a vivid reminder that they remained subjects, not citizens. Day by day, year by year, the foundation of loyalty that had once seemed so solid began to crack, spiderwebbing into tiny fractures that no king could see. But that would, in time, bring the whole house down. Boston's boiling point. Nowhere did the fires of anger burn hotter than in Boston. The city, perched on the edge of a restless sea, became a powder keg. British troops patrolled its narrow streets, red coats flashing in the sunlight, muskets close at hand. To many Bostonians, their presence was not protection, it was provocation. Tensions simmered, then boiled over. In March 1770, a simple, Confrontation between colonists and British soldiers spiraled into violence. Shots cracked the winter air. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. The Boston Massacre, they called it, and the name alone fanned the growing flames of rebellion. Still, Parliament pushed forward. The Tea Act of 1773, designed to help the struggling British East India Company, allowed it to sell tea directly to the colonies at lower prices, but it preserved the hated tax. To British lawmakers, it seemed a clever compromise. To colonial merchants and patriots, it was an insult wrapped in velvet on a cold December night. Anger found a new form. Disguised as Mohawk warriors, a group of colonists crept aboard 3 ships anchored in Boston Harbor. Chest after chest of British T-hundreds in all were split open and hurled into the dark water. The harbor itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the act. This was no simple protest. It was a declaration, a warning. A city, a colony, a people refusing to bow. In response, Britain cracked down harder. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, slammed into Boston like a hammer. The port was closed. Local government was curtailed. Soldiers quartered themselves in private homes, but instead of breaking Boston's spirit, these acts only welded it tighter to the cause of resistance. The first sparks had flown. The fire could no longer be contained, the pen before the sword. Even before muskets were raised and armies formed, words led the charge. Pamphlets fluttered through town squares and taverns like autumn leaves. Newspaper articles, speeches, sermons, all carried the electric current of new ideas. Revolution, at first, was fought with ink and paper. Writers like Samuel Adams, a tireless agitator, used words as weapons, rallying citizens to action. Committees of correspondence sprang up, linking towns and colonies in a growing web of shared outrage and shared dreams. Then came Thomas Paine. In January 1776, his pamphlet Common Sense hit the colonies like a thunderclap. Written in simple, searing language, Paine's words stripped away the last illusions of loyalty. He made the case not just for protest, but for independence, full, permanent, unapologetic, in farmhouses and city squares, around campfires, and in churches. Men and women read or heard Paine's words. They nodded. They argued. Some wept. For the first time, many could clearly imagine a future without a king, a country governed by its own people. Standing on its own, protests grew. Boycotts bit deep into British commerce. Local militias drilled on village greens. Town meetings became arenas for debate and planning, but even as the colonists organized, many still hesitated. Revolution was dangerous, uncertain. It promised change, but offered no guarantees of success. Families and friendships were torn. Some remained loyal to Britain, believing rebellion foolish or wrong, yet the tide was turning. The pen had done its work. Minds had shifted. Hearts had hardened. The colonies were no longer asking for kindness. They were preparing to demand freedom, a world on the edge. By the early months of 1775. The colonies stood poised on a knife's edge across New England, militias known as Minutemen trained in secret, ready to fight at a moment's notice. British, Spies watched nervously. Colonial leaders, men like John Hancock and Samuel Adams, were labeled traitors, marked for arrest. In taverns, the air buzzed with whispered plans. In churches, ministers spoke of liberty and sacrifice. On village greens, young boys and old men alike drilled with muskets and farm tools, preparing for a battle that had not yet come. Every tavern table, every blacksmith's forge, every dusty church pew became a forum for debate. Some argued for patience, for finding a peaceful solution. Others spoke of honor, of rights granted not by kings, but by God and nature. Even as the world spun forward toward conflict, uncertainty hung over everything. Could a scattered collection of colonies stand against the might of the British Empire? Could farmers and merchants defeat trained soldiers? Could a dream so new survive the weight of war? The answer, then, was unknown. All that was certain was that change was coming fast, and soon. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, intending to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebellious leaders. In the quiet town of Lexington, they met a small group of Minutemen, standing in defiance. And no one knows who fired the first shot. But once it rang out, there was no turning back. The world that had been a world ruled by distant kings and unquestioned. Obedience was slipping away. A new world, still fragile and uncertain, was struggling to be born. The colonies had crossed the threshold. Rebellion was no longer a whispered dream. It was reality, loud, bloody, and unstoppable. Chapter 6, War of Impossible Odds. The first light of April 19, 1775, broke over Lexington with a cool mist rising from the fields. Birds stirred in the hedgerows. Horses stamped nervously in their stables. It might have been an ordinary morning, except for the muskets cradled in the arms of the men gathering on the village green. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired it. But in that one crack of sound, a world shifted. Colonists clashed with British troops, and by day's end, blood stained the grass of Lexington and Concord. What had been a political dispute had become a shooting war across the colonies. Church bells tolled and drums were beaten. Minutemen, farmers, tradesmen, boys barely old enough to shave, shouldered their muskets and left their homes behind. A cause bigger than themselves was calling, and many answered without hesitation. Gunpowder smoke curled over battlefield and meadow, lingering like a restless spirit. The cries of the wounded mixed with the fierce, ragged cheers of men who dared. Believed that liberty was worth dying for. At Bunker Hill, they fought with desperate courage, even though the ground they defended would eventually fall. At every skirmish and siege, every farmstead turned battlefield, it became clear this was not a passing rebellion. It was a revolution. British forces, trained and disciplined, seemed unstoppable. Their numbers were greater, their weapons more advanced. The American colonists, in contrast, were an unruly band of militias, stitched together by will and hope, rather than by command. Yet, in every exchange of fire, in every retreat and counterattack, the spirit of defiance deepened. The revolution was no longer a question of if. It was a question of when and how dearly freedom would be bought. The spirit of 76, as the summer of 1776 unfurled, a sense of destiny began to take hold. In Philadelphia, Delegates from the 13 colonies gathered. The mood was heavy, the risk enormous. To declare independence was to commit treason, a crime punishable by death. Yet as days of debate stretched into nights, a common purpose emerged, fierce and undeniable. Thomas Jefferson, a quiet man with a sharp pen, drafted the document that would change the world. His words, carefully chosen and boldly delivered, echoed. With timeless power, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. On July 2nd, the Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration. Church bells rang out. Cannons boomed. Bonfires lit the warm summer night. The Declaration of Independence was more than a legal severing of ties with Britain. It was a proclamation to the world a new nation, born not from bloodlines or conquest, but from an idea that government must derive its power from the consent of the governed. Copies of the Declaration spread quickly, carried by horseback, by ship, by word of mouth. In towns and villages across the colonies, people gathered to hear the words read aloud. Some cheered, some wept, some trembled at the enormity of what they had dared to attempt. Kings and empires watched with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Could such a fragile, untested experiment survive the grinding machinery of war? In the summer heat of 1776, as flags were sown and hopes raised high, no one knew the answer. But the spirit of '76 had been set loose, and it would not be easily silenced. Hard winters and harder choices victory would not come swiftly. Instead, it would slog through mud and blood, hunger and heartbreak. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge tested the very soul of the Revolution. Washington's army, ragged, cold, and half-starved, made camp among the frozen hills of Pennsylvania. Men wrapped their feet in rags. Food was scarce. Disease stalked the camp like an invisible enemy, yet amid the suffering, something remarkable happened. The army did not dissolve into despair. Instead, it grew stronger under the guidance of Baron von Steuben, a stern Prussian officer. The troops trained with renewed purpose. Day after bitter day, they drilled, learning to move as one, to fight as a single body instead of scattered bands. Steuben barked commands in broken English, demonstrating maneuvers himself when words failed. Washington himself was the quiet center of the storm. His presence, calm, steady, resolute, gave his soldiers something more powerful than orders. It gave them hope. Hard choices had to be made, too. Supplies were requisitioned, sometimes without payment. Harsh discipline was enforced. Some questioned Washington's leadership. Some plotted to replace him. Yet through it all, he held the army together by sheer force of will. Elsewhere, alliances were being forged. Benjamin Franklin, with his wit and wisdom, worked tirelessly. In Paris, securing French support. Supplies, troops, and ships from France would eventually tip the balance of war, but that winter at Valley Forge, surrounded by ice and death, victory seemed a distant dream. It was a season that could have broken them. Instead, it hardened them into something new, not just an army, but a nation in the making. Victory's fragile crown The final acts of the revolution unfolded with a slow, aching inevitability. By 1781, the British found themselves overextended. They were sagging under the weight of endless battles across unfamiliar terrain. In Virginia, General Cornwallis dug in at Yorktown, hoping for relief by sea. Washington saw his chance. With French forces under General Rochambeau and a French fleet blocking the Chesapeake Bay, the noose tightened. In September, American and French troops marched toward Yorktown, cannons rumbling across the fields. Trenches were dug. Artillery rained down. Night and day, the bombardment continued, a relentless drumbeat of pressure inside Yorktown's crumbling defenses. British morale collapsed. Supplies dwindled. Hope withered. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered. His sword was offered not directly to Washington, but through intermediaries, a small but telling act of bitterness and defeat. The scene at Yorktown was not one of wild triumph. It was solemn, heavy with the weight of all that had been lost and all that still remained uncertain. The revolution had been won on paper at least. But the work of building a nation, of turning soaring words into lived reality, had only just begun. The new nation's crown was fragile, its future uncertain. The economy was in ruins. The government was a patchwork of compromises. Unity, so vital during war, now frayed under the pressures of peace. But in that moment, as cannons fell silent and flags were lowered, something undeniable had been born. A new nation, conceived in struggle, dedicated to an idea, and tempered by impossible odds, stood blinking into the harsh, beautiful light of a new dawn. The American story had begun not as a tale of easy victories, but as a testament to the stubborn, trembling courage of ordinary people who dared to believe that freedom was worth fighting for. Chapter 7. Building a New Dream. The revolution had ended, but peace did not bring certainty. Instead, it revealed the cracks hidden beneath the victory banners. With British rule gone, the former colonies faced a question larger than any battle. How should they govern themselves? In 1781, the Articles of Confederation became the first attempt to answer that question. A loose agreement between the states, the Articles created a government, but one bound tightly in fear of tyranny. Power remained scattered, each state clinging to its sovereignty like a prize. The national government had no president, no courts to settle disputes. It could make laws but not enforce them. It could request money but not demand it. It could raise armies but not maintain them without begging states for support. 81st, it seemed fitting. After all, they had fought a war to escape centralized authority. Caution was natural. Freedom, they believed, would bloom best without heavy hands steering its course. But as the years passed, the weaknesses became clear. Trade between states grew chaotic, with each imposing its own rules and tariffs. Inflation soared as states printed their own currencies. Foreign powers, seeing the young nation's divisions, refused to treat it seriously. Britain kept forts on American soil. Spain blocked access to the Mississippi River. Worse still, unrest brewed at home. Farmers in western Massachusetts, crushed by debt and taxes, rose up in Shays' Rebellion. Angry and armed, they stormed courthouses demanding relief. the government's helpless response sent a chill through the land. If small groups of farmers could defy the law and face no consequences, what hope did the fragile republic have? By the mid-1780s, many realized the hard truth. The Articles of Confederation had preserved liberty, but at the cost of stability. Without change, the dream of America could crumble before it had truly begun, forging the Constitution in the summer of 1787. In the stifling heat of Philadelphia, 55 delegates gathered to attempt the impossible. The Constitutional Convention was not called to amend small flaws. It was called because the very foundation of the government needed rebuilding. The men who assembled came from different walks of life: farmers, lawyers, merchants, soldiers, but they shared a grim understanding. Something had to change, or the experiment would fail. Windows were shuttered. Doors were locked. Secrecy wrapped the proceedings like a heavy cloak. Inside, debates raged. Voices rose. Tempers flared. Big states wanted power proportional to their populations. Small states demanded equal footing. Slavery, that deep wound already festering, cast long shadows over every compromise. Should enslaved people count toward a state's population? Could a nation built on liberty justify such chains? Through weeks of sweat and argument, through exhaustion and determination, a framework began to take shape. It was built on compromise, not perfection, but the best that fallible men could forge under pressure. The Constitution proposed a stronger central government, but one limited by checks and balances. Powers were divided among three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. No single branch could dominate. No single man could become a king. It was a government designed not for saints, but for people complex, flawed, striving people. It recognized ambition and sought to bind it. It embraced the idea that liberty demanded vigilance. On September 17, 1787, the delegates signed the finished document. Some did so with hope, others with heavy doubts. Benjamin Franklin, aged and wise, is said to have looked at the half-sun, carved into the back of the president's chair, and remarked that he believed it was a rising sun, not a setting one. The Constitution was not perfect. It left deep injustices untouched. But it was alive, a framework that could bend, grow, and improve across generations. It was not a guarantee of freedom. It was an opportunity, a living dream, written in ink, Bill of Rights, even as the ink dried on the Constitution. Concerns rippled across the new nation. Many feared that the new government, though carefully balanced, still held too much power. Without clear protections, what would stop it from trampling the very liberties the Revolution had fought to secure? To answer this fear, the Bill of Rights was born. James Madison, who had helped craft the Constitution itself, now took up the task of refining it. Drawing on earlier documents, the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, colonial charters, Madison proposed a series of amendments designed to shield individual freedoms from government overreach. The first 10 amendments ratified in 1791 guaranteed freedom of speech, of the press, of religion, and the right to assemble. They protected the right to bear arms, the right to a fair trial, and the right to privacy in one's home. They stated that powers not given to the federal government belonged to the states or the people. Each line was a fragile promise written in cautious hope. Each right was a shield against the ancient patterns of tyranny. The Bill of Rights did not solve all problems. It did not extend liberty to all, not to enslaved people, not to women, not to Native Americans. It would take generations and terrible struggles to stretch those promises to all who called America home, but it laid the cornerstone. It etched freedom into law. It whispered to every citizen then and now, "You have rights that no king can take, no government can erase." The Bill of Rights did not end the nation's work. It began it, the idea of America as the 18th century drew to a close. A new idea breathed life into the weary soil of the continent. America was no longer just a scattering of colonies, no longer a desperate rebellion, no longer a fragile alliance. It was a Republican experiment still trembling with uncertainty, but daring to believe it could succeed. Benjamin Franklin, ever wise and wry, was once asked what kind of government had been created. His answer carried the weight of warning. A republic, if you can keep it, keeping it would not be easy. The challenges loomed large: internal division, external threats, the ever-present temptation of power's corruption, but the idea of America, that government should serve the people, that freedom was not a gift granted by rulers, but a right born into every person, had been planted. It would not always grow smoothly. The road ahead would be steep and rough, marked by civil wars, struggles for civil rights, and fierce debates over what freedom meant. Yet, the seeds sown in those uncertain early years would take root in hearts across generations. From dusty classrooms to crowded town halls, from muddy battlefields to marble courthouses, the idea endured, the idea that a country could be more than borders and armies, that it could be a promise, a hope, a dream worth building, worth defending, worth striving toward. And though the future would bring storms the founders could scarcely imagine, the quiet, stubborn dream of America, imperfect, unfinished, and unforgettable, would continue to grow. The new dream had been built, not in certainty, but in courage, and it had only just begun. Chapter 8. Growing Pains. The revolution had ended, and a constitution had been born. But now came the hardest task of all, breathing life into the fragile idea of a new nation. In 1789, George Washington stood before a gathered crowd in New York City and took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. His hand rested lightly on a Bible. His voice, steady but solemn, carried across the hushed streets. Washington was not eager for power. He had already earned a place in history as a victorious general. But duty once again called him forward. And so he led, not with the ambition of a conqueror, but with the cautious, deliberate steps of a man who understood how easily power could erode freedom. Each decision Washington made set a precedent. Every small act would become a guide for those who came after. He formed the first cabinet, gathering minds like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to advise him. He oversaw the creation of the first national bank, the first census, and the first Supreme Court. Yet through it all, he moved carefully, shaping the presidency into an office of service, not rule. Perhaps his most important choice was the one he made at the end of his term to step down. To surrender power willingly, to hand it to another through peaceful election, was a radical act in a world still ruled by kings and emperors. Washington showed that leadership in America was not meant to be permanent or inherited. It was a trust borrowed for a time and then returned to the people. Through his steady hand and silent example, Washington gave the young republic its first true breath of life and its earliest proof that liberty and leadership could walk side by side. Whiskey rebellions and realities, but governing a restless, sprawling land was never going to be easy. Even as Washington guided the new government through its first steps, troubles brewed on the frontiers. In the western reaches of Pennsylvania, farmers grew angry over a federal tax placed on distilled spirits, particularly whiskey, which many small farmers relied on for trade and survival. To the farmers, the tax felt like a betrayal. Hadn't they fought a revolution to escape oppressive taxes? Now, it seemed, the new government was simply wearing a different face. Their anger turned to action. Protests flared. Tax collectors were harassed, tarred, and feathered. Open rebellion loomed. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 forced Washington into a painful decision. This young government, built on ideals of liberty, now had to show whether it could also enforce its laws. Washington called up a militia, 13,000 strong, and personally led them toward Pennsylvania. His presence alone was enough to scatter the rebellion. Bloodshed was largely avoided, but the message was clear. In this new republic, law and order would stand. It was a delicate balance. Liberty and authority, two forces that must live together, yet constantly pull apart. The Whiskey Rebellion revealed a deeper truth. Governing a free people was messier, more complicated, and more fragile than the soaring words of revolution had suggested. It required patience. It required compromise. And it required leaders willing to walk the narrow path between strength and oppression. The frontier remained wild. The people remained restless. And the dream of America, still young, learned another hard lesson. Freedom was not the absence of government, but the careful shaping of it. Parties and polarization as the 1790s unfolded. A new kind of battle took shape not with muskets and cannons, but with pamphlets, speeches, and bitter words political parties once feared as a threat to unity began to emerge. On one side stood the Federalists, led by men like Alexander Hamilton, who believed in a strong central government, close ties with Britain, and a vision of America as a rising industrial power. On the other side stood the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who championed states' rights, an agrarian ideal, and closer sympathies with revolutionary France. 81st, these divisions seemed like healthy debate, but soon they hardened into deep polarization. Newspapers often aligned with one party or the other, filled their pages with attacks and accusations. Campaigns turned bitter and personal, friendships fractured. Washington himself, dismayed by the growing divisions, warned in his farewell address against the dangers of political factions. He feared they would sharpen the spirit of revenge and open the door to foreign influence and corruption. Yet the divisions continued to grow. The election of 1796 saw John Adams, a Federalist, win the presidency, but with Thomas Jefferson, a Republican, as his vice president, due to the rules of the time. The two men, once allies, now found themselves awkwardly bridged between rival camps. The young republic, still fragile, was learning that the freedom to disagree also carried the danger of tearing itself apart. And so, even as the stars on the nation's flag multiplied, the threads binding the states together were tested again and again, not by foreign invaders, but by the passions and conflicts within the Second Revolution by the turn of the 19th century. A new storm was gathering across the seas. Britain and France remained locked in endless war. America, caught between the great powers, struggled to remain neutral. British ships seized American sailors. Trade routes were blockaded. Tensions rose. In 1812, the simmering anger boiled over. The United States declared war on Britain, launching what some would later call America's Second Revolution. The War of 1812 was fought across many fronts: the Atlantic Ocean, the Great Lakes, the fields and forests of the frontier. American forces suffered early defeats, including the burning of Washington, D.C., where British troops set fire to the Capitol and the White House, leaving the young nation's heart charred and smoking. But amid the ashes, new symbols of resilience were born. In the harbor of Baltimore, as British cannons pounded Fort McHenry, a battered American flag still flew defiantly. Watching from a distance, Francis Scott Key penned the words that would become the national anthem. "Oh, say, can you see? By the dawn's early light, the war dragged on in fits and starts, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Yet through the struggle, a new sense of American identity began to take root proud, stubborn, independent. In 1815, General Andrew Jackson's forces won a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans, ironically, after a peace treaty had already been signed. The war ended much as it had begun, with no clear winner, but with a clear shift in spirit. America had survived its second great trial. It had stood up to Britain again, not as a collection of colonies, but as a nation. The War of 1812 tested America's strength, exposed its vulnerabilities, and strengthened its resolve. It reminded the world and itself that the young republic was no passing experiment. It was here to stay. Chapter 9. Westward. Ever westward. The Revolution had ended, the Constitution written, and the flag had been planted firmly in the soil of a new nation. Yet beyond the towns and farms of the young United States, the land stretched out vast, wild, and unknown. To many, the western horizon shimmered like a promise. The frontier was more than geography. It was an idea, a feeling, a pull deep within the hearts of restless souls. It spoke of fresh starts, of open spaces, of fortunes waiting just beyond the next hill. Families packed their belongings into creaking wagons, kissed aging parents goodbye, and pointed their horses westward. Soldiers, traders, and dreamers followed trails worn thin by centuries of Native American footsteps. The Northwest Territory, lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains, beckoned with its green valleys and deep forests. New settlements sprang up almost overnight, rough and rugged, built from timber and hope, but the frontier was no easy paradise. It was a place where winters could kill, where crops could fail, and where isolation gnawed at even the strongest hearts. It was a place of danger from nature itself, and from the inevitable collisions between cultures and claims. Still, the frontier called it called to the spirit of independence that had birthed the nation. It called to the belief that a better life could always be found just a little farther west. In the quiet hours of dawn, when the mist clung low to the ground and the prairie stretched forever, the dream of the frontier whispered through the grass, "Come," it said. "Come and build something new, Trail of Tears." But as settlers pushed westward, they did not move into empty lands. Native American nations had lived, hunted, farmed, and worshipped there for thousands of years. Expansion brought a terrible cost. Under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was signed into law. It gave the federal government power to negotiate or force the relocation of native tribes to lands west of the Mississippi River. Some tribes agreed under pressure, believing it was the only way to survive. Others resisted fiercely, fighting wars they could not win. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, among others, were forced to leave their ancestral homelands. They marched westward along brutal, winding paths that would become known as the Trail of Tears. Men, women, and children trudged through rain, snow, and mud. Disease swept through their camps. Food ran low. Thousands died along the way, their bodies laid to rest in shallow, hurried graves beside the very trails they traveled. The Trail of Tears was not a single road, but many woven from sorrow. Broken treaties and shattered promises. For the native nations, it was more than just a loss of land. It was the severing of sacred ties to home, history, and identity. It was exile from the very soil that held the bones of their ancestors. And for America, it marked a stain, a deep, aching wound at the heart of the nation's westward dreams. Even as new towns rose and new farms flourished, the cost of expansion could never be measured in gold or crops alone. It was etched into the landscape in sorrow. Oregon, Texas, and destiny by the 1840s, the hunger for land for new beginnings. Burned brighter than ever, the Oregon Trail stretched from Missouri to the lush valleys of the Pacific Northwest. Families loaded their wagons with flour, bacon, rifles, and hope. The journey was long, hard, and unforgiving. Dust choked the air. Rivers had to be crossed by wagon and by hand. Mountains rose like walls against the sky. Disease, accidents, and exhaustion claimed many before they could glimpse the promised lands of Oregon. Yet still they came, carving wagon ruts deep into the earth, trails that would scar the land for generations. Farther south, another dream simmered. In Texas, American settlers, drawn by cheap land and the promise of freedom, clashed with the Mexican government. In 1836, after fierce battles like the one at the Alamo, Texas declared its independence and later sought to join the United States. The annexation of Texas and disputes over its borders would soon spark a war between the U.S. and Mexico. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, Mexico ceded vast swaths of territory lands that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. It was a moment of triumph for many Americans who believed deeply in manifest destiny. The belief that the United States was destined even divinely ordained, to spread across the continent, but destiny was not without cruelty. The westward surge displaced countless native nations. It ignited conflicts over slavery in the new territories, and it sowed seeds of division that would one day tear the country apart. Every mile west gained was a mile heavy with hope and heavy with cost. The dream of America grew larger, but also more complicated, more fragile, more perilous. The gold fever then, in 1848, a discovery set the world alight. In the quiet foothills of the Sierra Nevada, at a place called Sutter's Mill, a worker noticed something glittering in the cold waters of a river. Gold. Word spread like wildfire. By 1849, tens of thousands of fortune seekers flooded into California. They came from every corner of America and from across the oceans. China, Europe, South America. They came by wagon, by ship, and by sheer desperate determination. The gold rush had begun. Boom towns sprang up almost overnight. San Francisco grew from a sleepy village to a bustling port city. Tents and rough cabins lined muddy streets. Saloons and gambling halls buzzed with fevered hope. In the riverbeds and hills, men toiled from dawn to dusk, panning, digging, dreaming. Some struck it rich. Many found only dust and disappointment. The gold rush reshaped California forever. It brought railroads, new industries, and a surge of immigration. It accelerated the push for California's statehood, adding new weight to the debates over slavery that already strained the nation. But amid the shining dreams, there was darkness too. Native American communities suffered devastating losses. Displaced again, attacked, their lands stolen or ravaged. Lawlessness reigned in many towns, and violence was a daily risk. For every fortune made, many more were lost. For every dream realized, countless others crumbled into the dust. The rivers glittered with gold and ran dark with the chaos it brought. By the time the gold rush ended, America's western frontier had been forever changed. The dream of fortune had driven thousands westward, shaping new lives, new cities, and new conflicts. The horizon still beckoned. But with every step forward, the story of America grew more tangled, a land of hope, sorrow, triumph, and tragedy woven together beneath a restless sky. Chapter 10. A house dividing. As the 19th century unfolded, the American experiment stood at a crossroads, pulled in two by forces deeper than geography or politics. The issue of slavery, present since the nation's founding, grew heavier with each passing year. It was a wound that bandages could not heal, a contradiction that compromise could only postpone, not solve. Again and again, leaders tried to stitch together uneasy peace. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was one such attempt. It allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state, keeping a fragile balance between North and South. It drew an invisible line across the map, hoping geography could divide the issue cleanly, but lines on paper could not hold back the tides of human struggle. As new territories opened in the West, the question returned, would they be free or slave? Every new state, every new acre of land, became a battlefield without cannons, a war fought with votes and legislation. In 1850, another compromise tried to hold the center. California would enter as a free state, but a harsher fugitive slave. Law would be enforced, demanding that escaped slaves be returned to bondage even from free northern states. It was a bitter trade, one that left neither side truly satisfied. Compromises were not victories. They were desperate acts to buy time that was quickly running out. The cracks in the Union widened. The political debates grew sharper. Beneath the polished words of senators and statesmen, the truth was becoming clear. No compromise could forever quiet a conflict rooted in the definition of human freedom itself, a house divided against itself. As one man would soon warn, could not stand the Underground Railroad while lawmakers argued in halls of marble. Another struggle unfolded quietly, in fields and forests, across rivers and through hidden doorways. The Underground Railroad was not a real railroad, and its stations had no signs. It was a secret network of routes and safe houses, built on whispers and courage, designed to help enslaved people escape to freedom. Conductors, brave men and women, black and white alike, risked everything to lead others to safety. They guided the fleeing by moonlight through swamps, forests, and back roads. They hid families in barns, cellars, and hidden compartments. Each step toward freedom was perilous. Rewards were offered for capture. Laws made harboring escapees a crime. Yet still they ran. Harriet Tubman, herself once enslaved, became one of the most famous conductors. She returned to the South again and again, leading dozens to freedom, armed with little more than her faith and a fierce will, the Underground. Railroad was not a single path, but a living, breathing act of resistance. It stretched from the plantations of the South to the free cities of the North, even into Canada. Every successful escape was a defiance of an unjust system. Every life saved was a victory against a world built on chains. A T was a quiet revolution, fought not with armies, but with courage stitched into every trembling step across the darkened land, even as lawmakers crafted compromises and slave catchers. Prowled the borders, the Underground Railroad carried a message more powerful than any law. Human beings could never truly be property. Freedom had its own gravity, pulling souls northward, onward, homeward. John Brown's fire, but not all resistance moved in silence. By the late 1850s, frustration burned hotter. Some believed that words, marches, and secret routes were no longer enough. Among them was John Brown, a fierce, unyielding abolitionist who believed slavery must be destroyed by force. Brown was no politician. He was a man of conviction, shaped by violence and loss. To him, slavery was not just a wrong, it was a sin that cried out for righteous judgment. In 1859, Brown launched his boldest plan. With a small group of followers, both black and white, he attacked the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to seize weapons and spark a slave uprising that would sweep across the South. The raid failed. Local militias and federal troops, led by Robert E. Lee, quickly surrounded Brown and his men. After a brief, bloody fight, Brown was captured. Wounded but unbroken. At his trial, Brown spoke with a calm, fierce dignity, declaring that he believed the cause of the enslaved was just. His execution by hanging made him a martyr to some, a terrorist to others, but no one ignored him. John Brown's raid sent shockwaves through the nation. In the South, fear tightened its grip, fear of rebellion, fear of change. fear that the North condoned such violence. In the North, many who rejected Brown's methods still could not ignore the raw truth he had exposed. Slavery was a fire that would not be contained forever. In the end, John Brown failed to start the war he sought, but he helped light a fuse that could not be snuffed out, the election that shattered unity. The final blow came in the election of 1860. 4 candidates vied for the presidency, each representing a fractured piece of a fractured nation. At the center stood Abraham Lincoln, a man of humble beginnings and towering intellect, representing the newly formed Republican Party, a party founded in opposition to the spread of slavery. Lincoln was not yet the symbol he would become, but his election was seen by many in the South as a death knell for their way of life. He won without carrying a single Southern state. To Southern leaders, this was proof that they no longer had a voice in the Union. If a president could be elected without their support, could laws not be passed without their consent? Could their institutions, their very livelihoods, be abolished by distant majorities? Before Lincoln could even take the oath of office, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. Other states quickly followed. One by one, they declared their independence, forming a new confederacy with its own government, flag, and army. The nation had cracked wide open what years of compromise, debate, and sacrifice had failed to solve. The ballot box had finally forced into the light. In the dark chill of early 1861, with the country trembling on the edge of war, Lincoln traveled quietly to Washington under threat of assassination. As he took the presidency, the Capitol was ringed with soldiers, its very foundation girded against collapse. The Union, fragile, battered, and bloodied, now faced its greatest trial. The dream of America had survived revolution and rebellion, compromise and conquest. But now it faced itself, and the coming storm would test whether a nation founded on hope could survive its own divisions. Chapter 11. The Civil War's Bloody Reckoning. In the soft dawn of April 12, 1861, the world held its breath. At Fort Sumter, a stone fortress guarding the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Union soldiers waited behind cold, damp walls. Supplies were low. Tension weighed heavier than the cannons overhead across the water. Confederate guns stood ready. For months, the Union had clung to its shrinking outposts in the South, hoping that time and reason could mend a divided country. But the tide had already turned. Negotiations had failed. Trust had crumbled. And then at 4:30 a.m., the silence shattered. A Confederate shell arched into the sky and exploded above the fort. More followed, streaking through the early light like fiery messengers. The roar of cannons rolled over the waters, waking a sleeping nation. The battle lasted 34 hours. Walls crumbled. Flags burned. Smoke choked the air inside the fort. Union Major Robert Anderson and his men fought bravely, but their position was hopeless. Outnumbered and outgunned, Anderson surrendered. Remarkably, not a single soldier died in the bombardment, yet Fort Sumter's fall signaled something far deadlier across America. Newspapers carried the news with heavy headlines. In North and South alike, crowds gathered, shouting cheers or weeping silent tears. The first shots had been fired. Now there was no turning back. A house divided could no longer stand on speeches and hopes alone. The Civil War had begun, a conflict that would soak the fields and rivers of the nation with blood, a reckoning for every compromise that had delayed the inevitable. The thunder of Fort Sumter echoed across the land, and in its rumbling wake, a generation would march toward history's greatest trial, brothers at arms. As the months unfolded, the war grew not as a distant affair, but as a personal sorrow. It was a war that tore families apart, brothers who once sat side by side at supper. Tables now were different colors, Union blue or Confederate gray. Fathers sent sons to opposing camps. Cousins met each other on bloody battlefields, guns raised, hearts torn. The war's lines were not just drawn across states, but through living rooms, churches, and friendships. In small towns, enlistment drums beat steadily. Young men, faces full of pride and fear, kissed mothers goodbye and joined regiments. Storefronts shuttered. Farms stood silent. Communities, once bustling with life, became ghostly and hollow as the war siphoned away the able-bodied. Both North and South believed their cause was righteous. The Union fought for preservation, for the idea that one nation could endure. The Confederacy fought for independence, believing their way of life, their economy, their rights, including the right to own slaves, were under siege. The battles that followed were brutal and unrelenting. Fields once green with wheat and corn became muddy wastelands, littered with broken bodies. Rivers ran red after each clash. Forests shuddered under the thunder of artillery. At places like Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, dreams withered under the deafening roar of muskets and cannon fire. Letters home were stained with ink and tears. Some spoke of heroism. Others spoke of horror too deep for words. By the war's end, over 600,000 Americans would be dead, more than in any other conflict in U.S. history. The Civil War was not a distant tragedy. It was a personal grief, written one broken family at a time. It was a war fought not in far-off lands, but on the very soil that had once symbolized hope. Turning points for 2 long years. The war raged without clear end. Then, in the summer of 1863, 2 turning points reshaped the destiny of the nation. First came Gettysburg. A small town in Pennsylvania became the stage for the war's bloodiest battle. Over 3 desperate days, July 1st to July 3rd, Union and Confederate forces clashed among rolling hills, stone walls, and wheat fields. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, and heartbreaking. At places like Little Round Top, Union soldiers fought tooth and nail to hold the high ground. On Cemetery Ridge, Pickett's charge became a doomed, desperate assault, a wall of Confederate soldiers marching into a storm of gunfire and cannon smoke. When the battle ended, more than 50,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The Confederate army, battered and bloodied, retreated south. They would never again seriously threaten northern soil. Just 1 day later, far to the west, another blow struck. At Vicksburg, Mississippi, Union General Ulysses S. Grant achieved a hard-fought victory, seizing control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy, split in 2, lost a vital lifeline. These twin victories, Gettysburg in the east, Vicksburg in the west, shifted the tide of the war. For the first time, hope stirred anew in the north. And in the south, a grim realization began to grow. Victory might not be within reach, yet the war was far from over. Years of struggle still lay ahead. Battles still needed to be fought. Cities would still burn. Lives would still be lost, but the momentum had changed. The rivers of blood spilled at Gettysburg and Vicksburg carried with them a new current, one that would, at terrible cost, guide the Union toward eventual victory, a martyr's fall by the spring of 1865, after for long, brutal years. The Confederacy collapsed. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. The guns finally fell silent. The war was over. In Washington, there was cautious celebration. Flags flew. Bells rang. Families embraced. Tears of relief mingling with memories of loss. At the heart of the victory stood President Abraham Lincoln, weary, hollow-eyed, but steadfast. He spoke not of vengeance, but of healing. His second inaugural address had pleaded for malice toward none and charity for all. He dreamed of binding the nation's wounds and rebuilding a broken land, but fate, cruel and swift, intervened on the night of April 14, 1865. Just days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. As he watched the performance, an assassin crept into the presidential box. John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer and actor, raised a pistol and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president slumped forward, never to awaken. America plunged into mourning. News spread by telegraph, by messenger, by word of mouth. In North and South alike, people wept openly in the streets. Black cloths draped doorways. Church bells tolled mournful notes across the valleys and hills. Lincoln had become more than a man. In death, he became a symbol of sacrifice, of perseverance, of a nation's battered, stubborn hope. The Civil War had begun with a thunderclap at Fort Sumter and ended with a single, shattering shot in a quiet theater, the dream of a united America. Had survived the war, but it carried deep scars, and though the cannons had fallen silent, the work of healing had only just begun. Chapter 12. Scars and New Beginnings. The Civil War had ended. The guns had fallen silent. The flags of rebellion had been furled and stored away, but the South, once vibrant with fields of cotton and bustling towns, now lay in ruins, cities like. Richmond and Atlanta stood blackened and hollow, their streets filled with rubble and soot. Railroads lay twisted like broken bones. Fields once neat with rows of crops were now wild with weeds or scarred by trenches and forgotten battles. The economy, once propped up by the labor of enslaved people, had collapsed almost overnight. Banks failed. Plantations withered. Wealth that had once seemed endless vanished like mist in the morning sun, but the deepest wounds were not carved into the land. They were carved into the hearts of the people. Loss clung to every household. Fathers, sons, brothers buried far from home or never found at all. Widows walked slowly past shuttered stores, their black dresses a quiet mourning. Children grew up with stories of a war they barely remembered, but could never escape, and alongside grief, resentment festered. Many in the South felt humiliated by defeat, stripped of their dignity as well as their fortunes. They blamed the Union. They blamed their leaders. They blamed fate, but rarely themselves. freedmen, newly liberated Black Americans sought new lives in the ruins, facing hostility at every turn. Some took to farming tiny plots of land. Others worked as laborers, teachers, or preachers. But their freedom was fragile, shadowed by the anger and fear that filled the broken South. The war was over, but the healing had barely begun. Reconstructions. Hope and betrayal at first. There was a flicker of light dot in the years following the war. Reconstruction promised to rebuild not only the South's buildings, but its soul. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship to all born in America. The 15th gave Black men the right to vote. For the first time, Black Americans were elected to Congress. Schools were opened. Freedmen's bureaus provided aid, education, and hope for a brief, shining moment. It seemed possible that America could truly remake itself more just, more equal, more whole. But hope is fragile. White resistance to Reconstruction was fierce and often violent. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose from the ashes of defeat, their robes and burning crosses symbols of hatred and terror. Black voters were intimidated, beaten, even murdered. Churches and schools were burned. Laws were twisted to strip away newly. One writes, Northern support for Reconstruction, so strong in the war's aftermath, began to waver. Political fatigue set in. Economic concerns pulled attention elsewhere. By 1877, with a compromise that ended the contested presidential election, Reconstruction officially ended. Federal troops withdrew from the South. Black citizens were left defenseless against the rising tide of white supremacy. Jim Crow laws soon codified segregation. Separate but equal became the cruel lie of a society bent on preserving inequality. The promises of Reconstruction, so bold, so full of potential, faded like footprints in the dust. Yet even in betrayal, seeds had been planted. Seeds of resilience, of determination, of a dream deferred but never destroyed. Reconstruction had failed to heal the wounds of the Civil War, but it had lit the fire, one that would burn quietly through decades of struggle to come. Industrial sparks. While the South struggled under the weight of its past, the North surged into a new era. In smoky cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York, iron gave way to steel. Great bridges leaped across rivers. Railroads stitched the country together with gleaming iron threads. Factories roared to life, belching steam and smoke into once quiet skies. The Industrial Revolution had arrived in America. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan built empires of steel, oil, and finance. Immense fortunes grew alongside soaring skylines. America was becoming not just a nation of farmers and merchants, but a titan of industry. Inventions changed daily life at a dizzying pace. The telephone, the electric light, the typewriter. Dreams that once seemed like science fiction became part of everyday reality. Railroads transformed the land. Small towns became bustling cities overnight. Goods that once took months to move now traveled in days. People, too, moved faster westward, eastward, wherever opportunity called. But the bright lights of industry cast long shadows. Workers toiled in dangerous factories for long hours and meager wages. Children small enough to crawl into tight. Machinery worked alongside their parents. Labor strikes erupted. The gap between rich and poor widened. Still, the promise of progress was intoxicating America, once a patchwork of scattered colonies, was becoming something new powerful. Restless, ever-changing. A land of engines and ambition, steam and steel, a place where dreams could be built with iron hands, but where the cost of those dreams could never be forgotten. Immigrant dreams, and through it all, across the oceans, the world watched from Ireland. Germany, Italy, China, and beyond, waves of immigrants crossed the seas, crammed into steamships, hearts heavy with hope and fear. They came for work, for freedom, for the dream that, no matter how humble their beginnings, they could build better lives. Ellis Island, off the coast of New York, became the golden door to America. Each day, long lines of tired families shuffled through its great halls, clutching suitcases and worn papers. Doctors inspected eyes and throats. Officials asked endless questions. Some were turned away, their hopes shattered. But most passed through. Stepping into the uncertainty of a new land, they fanned out across the country, building railroads, digging canals, sewing garments, opening tiny shops in crowded tenements and smoky factories. They lived hard lives. They faced suspicion, prejudice, and crushing poverty. Newspapers warned of foreign hordes. Politicians built careers on fear of the other. Yet still, they came. They built neighborhoods filled with the smells of old country cooking, the sounds of old country songs. They stitched new lives from tattered dreams. Over time, they transformed America, making it richer, more vibrant, more complex. Their languages, their foods, their traditions wove into the nation's fabric. Statues rose in city squares. Festivals lit up city streets. Children who spoke broken English would grow to lead companies. Schools and governments. Immigration was not an easy story. It was a story of struggle and sacrifice. But it was also a story of renewal, a reminder that America's greatest strength often came from those brave enough to begin again. The old scars of war and injustice would never fully fade, but in the humming factories, in the bustling ports, in the crowded city streets, the nation's heart beat unscarred. Yes, but still alive, still reaching, still dreaming. A new beginning was unfolding, one small, stubborn hope at a time. Chapter 13. The Gilded Cage. By the end of the 19th century, America glittered in the eyes of the world. Cities rose like steel mountains. Bridges spanned mighty rivers. Electric lights turned night into day. Fortune smiled on some and turned its back on many more. It was an era known as the Gilded Age, a time of dazzling wealth and deep, hidden struggles. Millionaires built mansions that looked like European palaces. In New York and Newport, marble halls and golden chandeliers dazzled guests in silk and velvet. Fine carriages rolled down broad avenues, while orchestras played and champagne flowed like rivers. Yet just a few streets away, another America gasped for breath. In smoky factories and crowded tenements, children worked 12-hour shifts, threading needles, stitching boots, running looms. Their hands, small and quick, were prized by factory owners. Their backs bent early under the weight of machines, families packed into single rooms. Clean water was a luxury. Disease stalked narrow alleys where sunlight never reached. The divide between rich and poor grew wider with every passing year. Newspapers praised the self-made men who climbed from poverty to power. But for every rags to riches story, there were thousands trapped in rags, with no ladder to climb. America, it seemed, was two nations living side by side, one draped in gold, the other shackled by survival. The streets were filled with noise and life. But beneath the bustle, a slow, steady tension grew, a tension that would not stay silent forever. The robber barons at the heart of America's new wealth stood, a handful of men who shaped the nation's destiny and reaped its rewards. Andrew Carnegie, born poor in Scotland, built an empire of steel. He supplied the beams that raised skyscrapers toward the clouds and bridges across great rivers. Carnegie preached the gospel of wealth, urging the rich to give back even as he crushed unions and slashed wages. John D. Rockefeller transformed oil into a force that fueled the world. His company, Standard Oil, controlled nearly every drop that flowed through America's pipelines. His fortunes became legend, and his methods ruthless. Relentless set the tone for corporate power. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, ruled the railroads and the shipping lanes. His influence stitched distant cities together with iron and steam, making him one of the wealthiest men the world had ever seen. They were called captains of industry by some, robber barons by others. Their achievements were breathtaking. Their philanthropy built libraries, universities, museums. Yet their dominance squeezed out competitors, crushed small businesses, and widened the gulf between those at the top and those struggling at the bottom. They reshaped America with ambition and iron fists, building fortunes so vast they seemed almost mythical. Yet for many, their castles of wealth were built on shaky foundations of exploited labor, broken promises, and silenced dreams. The robber barons defined an age, but they also defined its limits and its inevitable reckoning. Workers unite as factories multiplied and fortunes grew. So too did the cries for justice. Workers, men, women, and children began to realize they were not powerless alone. If they could stand together, labor unions rose from the dust and smoke. They demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair wages. They organized strikes, marched through city streets, and sent petitions to deaf political ears. The great railroad strike of 1877 swept across the country like wildfire, sparked by wage cuts and harsh conditions. Workers tore up tracks, blocked trains, and faced down armed militias. Though crushed by force, the strike lit a fire that would never fully die. In 1886, workers in Chicago rallied for an 8-hour workday. The Haymarket Square rally began peacefully but ended in bloodshed after a bomb exploded among police and protesters. Fear of anarchism and labor unrest spread, but so did determination. The Pullman strike of 1894 saw rail workers walk off the job, paralyzing rail traffic nationwide. Federal troops were sent in. Violence erupted. Lives were lost. For every victory, there were setbacks. Union leaders were jailed. Strikers were blacklisted. Corporations hired private armies to break picket lines. Yet the seeds had been planted. Labor, Leaders like Samuel Gompers worked to unite scattered efforts into organized movements. The American Federation of Labor emerged, building a foundation for worker rights that would grow in the years ahead. The battle for dignity was messy, painful, and unfinished, but for millions who toiled in the sweat and smoke of America's engines, the message was clear. Change would not be given. It would have to be demanded, and in the echo of every hammer blow, every sewing machine, every clattering printing press, the slow, stubborn beat of justice marched on, the progressive awakening out of the noise and smoke of the Gilded Age. A new spirit began to rise, the progressive movement part anger, part hope sought to heal the fractures of a divided nation. Journalists, known as muckrakers, pulled back the golden curtain. Writers like Ida Tarbell exposed the ruthless practices of Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, revealed the horrors of the meatpacking industry where rats and filth contaminated the food of the nation. Their words sparked outrage. And action, middle-class reformers, church groups, and newly educated women pushed for change. They fought for clean water, for public health, for food safety. They demanded laws to protect children from factory floors and women from dangerous sweatshops. Political leaders, sensing the shift, followed. Theodore Roosevelt, a man of fierce energy and deep conviction, rose to the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley. Roosevelt, calling for a square deal, targeted monopolies, strengthened consumer protections, and conserved vast stretches of wilderness from corporate exploitation. Progressivism was not a single cause, but a broad, sprawling fight for fairness. In business, in government, in society itself, victories came slowly. Antitrust laws cracked open corporate giants. Workers won shorter hours and safer conditions. Voters gained the power to choose senators directly. Women, long denied a voice, organized for the right to vote, laying the groundwork for battles soon to come. The progressive era did not erase the scars of the Gilded Age. It could not fully bridge the gap between rich and poor, or root out every injustice, but it proved something powerful, that America, even when gilded and cracked, could change, that the golden cages of the few could be opened, even if only a little, by the many voices of the determined. The dream of a fairer nation stirred. Again fragile, imperfect, but alive, and from the dust of industry and the shadows of the city slums, a new America began to rise. Chapter 14. World on Fire. In the summer of 1914, a spark in a far-off corner of Europe set the world ablaze. A single gunshot in Sarajevo rippled outward like a stone tossed into still water, awakening old rivalries, tangled alliances, and deep unspoken fears. By 1917, America, long watching from across the Atlantic, could remain a spectator no longer. The United States entered the Great War, a conflict unlike any the world had ever seen. Across the oceans, soldiers slogged through endless trenches carved deep into the European countryside. Mud, rats, and barbed wire defined the new battlefield. Machine guns rattled without end. Poison gas crept silently along the ground, stealing breath from the living. The sky, once the realm of birds and dreams, became a hunting ground for airplanes and bombers. Tanks, lumbering and new, rumbled across cratered fields. It was called the war to end all wars, But to those who lived it, it seemed a war with no end in sight. American doughboys, young and wide-eyed, arrived in France full of hope and swagger. They marched through ruined villages and along shattered roads. They fought at places like Below Wood and the Meuse Argonne, where bravery was measured not in victories, but in survival. Death came swiftly and often. Shells rained down day and night. Friends vanished into sudden explosions. Orders were given and obeyed, often with little more than a prayer. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, millions had died. Entire generations of men had been swept away, the trenches. The terror, the sacrifice, all had left deep scars across the globe. The world was changed. And America, too, would never be the same. The home front, while the battlefields of Europe burned, life in America shifted in quiet, profound ways. Factories once built for peace now turned out rifles, artillery shells, and uniforms. Steel and coal became as vital as food and medicine. Fields that had fed towns now fed armies, and when men left for war, women stepped forward to fill the gap. Across the country, women donned overalls and gloves, trading kitchens and parlors for factories and shipyards. They welded steel beams, built airplanes, packed munitions. Their hands shaped the very engines of war. On farms, they drove tractors and harvested crops, keeping food flowing to soldiers and civilians alike. In offices, women typed war reports, managed ledgers, and organized drives for supplies and war bonds. Their contributions were critical, and their dreams stirred. If they could build planes and run companies in wartime, why should they be denied a voice in peace? The war accelerated the push for women's suffrage, bringing the long struggle closer to victory. Minority communities, too, carried heavy, often invisible burdens. African Americans, seeking better lives, moved north in what became known as the Great Migration. They found work in factories, new neighborhoods in cities like Chicago and Detroit, and new battles against discrimination and violence. Native Americans enlisted in high numbers, serving with pride and distinction. Yet they returned to a nation that still denied them full citizenship. For many, the war was fought on two fronts, one overseas and one at home, against old barriers that refused to fall. The war changed who Americans were. It stretched the meaning of citizenship, cracked open old roles, and laid bare old injustices. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, another war, the quiet war for equality, recognition, and dignity, marched on without pause, a fragile peace. The end of the fighting brought no easy celebration. In Paris, in 1919, leaders of the victorious nations gathered to shape a new world. Hopes were high. Woodrow Wilson, America's president, came with grand dreams, a League of Nations to bind countries together in peace, new borders drawn with fairness, justice for all. But hopes withered under the weight of politics and resentment. France and Britain, battered and bitter, demanded reparations from Germany. They wanted guarantees that such horror could never happen again, and payments to rebuild their shattered lands. Germany, stripped of colonies, burdened with crushing debts, humiliated by blame, simmered with anger and despair. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to heal, instead planted seeds of future wars. Many in America, weary from sacrifice and skeptical of foreign entanglements, rejected the League of Nations entirely. Wilson, exhausted and ill, could not turn the tide. The Senate refused to ratify the treaty. America withdrew from the New World Order it had helped imagine. The peace that emerged was not solid stone. It was cracked glass, shimmering briefly before the pressure of old hatreds and new ambitions would shatter it once more. The war to end all wars had ended, but its legacy and its lessons had only just begun to unfold. The Red Scare back home. A different kind of fear crept across the American landscape. The end of the war had not brought calm. It had unleashed a storm of uncertainty. Strikes paralyzed factories. Racial tensions exploded into deadly riots. Anarchists sent bombs to the homes of prominent politicians and businessmen across the ocean. The Russian Revolution had birthed the world's first communist state. To many Americans, it seemed a dark tide was rising, threatening to wash away everything familiar. Thus began the Red Scare. In newspapers, fiery headlines warned of a looming revolution. In city streets, peaceful protests were sometimes mistaken for conspiracies. Immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe, fell under suspicion, their accents and customs wrongly seen as signs of danger. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer led raids across the country, arresting thousands without warrants, deporting many without trial. Homes were ransacked, meetings broken up, lives shattered by rumor and fear. Civil liberties, once so proudly defended, were brushed aside. Fear, like wildfire, needed little fuel to grow. The Red Scare revealed deep anxieties within America. Fears of change, fears of the unknown, fears of difference. In the end, the predicted revolution never came. The panic faded. But the scars remained scars of mistrust, division, and lost innocence. In the roaring 20s that followed, America would dance to jazz and chase new dreams. But underneath the music, underneath the laughter, the lessons of war, fear, and fragile peace would remain, quietly shaping the road ahead. Chapter 15. Roar, crash, and dust. When the guns of World War I fell silent. A restless energy swept across America. The 1,920 seconds roared to life, not with the march of soldiers, but with a wild pulse of jazz. Cities buzzed with excitement. In smoke-filled clubs, trumpets blared and saxophones wept, weaving melodies that danced into the early hours. The music was fast, daring, alive, a soundtrack for a nation eager to forget sorrow. Women, known as flappers, cast aside corsets and conventions. They wore bobbed hair, daring dresses, and bright red lipstick. They danced the Charleston, laughed loudly, and demanded their place in the bright lights of the New World. Prohibition, meant to rid the country of alcohol's dark influence, instead created a booming underground. Hidden speakeasies thrived behind secret doors, serving forbidden drinks to crowds hungry for excitement. Bootleggers became legends, and gangsters like Al Capone ruled the shadows with guns and grins. Technology raced forward. Radios brought music and news into living rooms. Silent films flickered in grand theaters. The Model T Ford rolled off assembly lines, putting the thrill of the open road within reach of everyday people. Airplanes soared across the skies. Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic captured imagination's proof that the impossible was suddenly within reach. America felt young, fast, invincible. But beneath the glitter, the ground trembled, the wealth of the few grew heavier, while the wages of the many lagged behind. Farms, once the backbone of the nation, quietly withered under falling prices. The roaring 20s roared loudly enough to drown out doubt, yet storms were already gathering. Far beyond the jazz-soaked nights, the market crumbles the dream of endless prosperity shattered on a single black day, October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. On that morning, the stock market collapsed, pulling the nation's fortunes into a deep, dark spiral dot. In the years leading up to the crash, stocks had become more than investments. They were seen as golden tickets to wealth. Ordinary people, lured by the promise of quick riches, borrowed heavily to buy shares. Banks, eager for profits, loosened their rules. Speculation ran wild. For a while, it seemed the good times would never end, but markets built on sand cannot stand forever. When the bubble burst, panic flooded Wall Street. Investors scrambled to sell. Prices plummeted. Fortunes evaporated in minutes. Banks failed, their vaults emptied of savings. Businesses shuddered. Families lost homes, farms, and futures. Unemployment soared. Bread lines stretched down city blocks. Soup kitchens struggled to feed the hungry. The crash was not just an economic failure. It was a collapse of faith in the system, faith in the future, faith in the promises of the American dream. The roaring 20s fell silent dot in the cold light of the Great Depression. The glitz and glamour of the previous decade seemed like cruel illusions. Hope became a fragile thing, easily broken by hunger and fear. Across the country, people tightened their belts, pulled their coats closer, and waited for work, for relief, for a way to rebuild from the ruins. Dust bowl despair, as if the crash had not been enough. Nature itself turned against the heartland dot. In the early 1930s, the Great Plains, once lush with tall grasses, became a barren wasteland. Years of over-farming, combined with drought and high winds, stripped the soil of its life. Without roots to hold it down, the earth itself rose into the air. Dust storms, black as night, swept across the land. They blotted out the sun. They buried homes, barns, and entire towns beneath drifting dunes. Cattle choked and died. Crops withered before they could take root. Families sealed windows and stuffed rags under doors, but the dust found its way in filling lungs, stinging eyes, coating every surface with a fine, suffocating powder. They called it the Dust Bowl. Farmers watched their dreams dry up and blow away. Many packed what little they had into battered cars and wagons, heading west toward California, hoping to find work, to find dignity. The journey was long and bitter. Camps of desperate migrants, called Okies, whether they came from Oklahoma or elsewhere, sprang up along dusty highways. They faced discrimination, low wages, and endless hardship. John Steinbeck would later capture their plight in The Grapes of Wrath, a story that spoke for countless voices worn raw by loss. The Dust Bowl was more than a natural disaster. It was a reckoning, a painful reminder that even the richest soil can be exhausted, that even the proudest people can be brought low by forces beyond their control. And still, Through grit and stubborn hope, they endured, waiting for rain. Waiting. For change, New Deals for a broken nation in 1932, with the country sinking deeper into despair. Americans turned to a new voice, a new vision. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president with a simple promise, a new deal for the American people. Roosevelt's approach was bold, experimental, and relentless. He believed government should not stand aside, but step forward to ease suffering, to rebuild shattered confidence, to offer hope. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt launched an avalanche of programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees, building parks, and restoring forests. The Works Progress Administration employed artists, writers, and laborers to build roads, paint murals, and lift the nation's spirits. The Social Security Act created a safety net for the elderly and unemployed, a promise that Americans would not face their final years abandoned. Banks were reformed. Stock markets were regulated. Unions gained new rights to organize and bargain for fair wages. Roosevelt's fireside chats calm. Friendly radio addresses reassured a fearful nation. His voice crackled over the airwaves, carrying warmth and determination into living rooms across the country. Critics abounded. Some said he was doing too much. Others said not enough. But for millions of desperate Americans, Roosevelt represented a lifeline when all others had frayed and snapped. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression, not fully, not quickly, but it changed the relationship between the American people and their government forever. It proved that even in the darkest times, action mattered. Compassion mattered, that government, when guided by purpose and courage, could be a force for rebuilding not just buildings and banks, but dreams. And in the slow, stubborn recovery that followed, the nation remembered how to hope once again. Chapter 16. The Fires of World War II. In the cool morning hours of December 7, 1941, the Pacific waters near Pearl Harbor stirred with an unexpected violence. Above the gentle hum of everyday life, the sky suddenly roared alive with the buzz of enemy planes. In moments, bombs rained down, tearing through steel, wood, and the delicate fabric of peace. Sailors scrambled across the decks, smoke billowing into the blue as ships listed and burned. By the end of that day, over 2,400 lives were lost, and countless others were forever altered. The attack was swift, devastating, and complete, a shudder that ran through every town and every heart across America. In living rooms, news crackled through radios, telling tales of destruction so surreal that many could scarcely believe it. Yet, the truth was unavoidable. The ocean that had once seemed a distant barrier was no longer enough. Within days, the United States, once hesitant to join the conflicts raging overseas, stood firmly resolved. Factories that had made cars and radios were now molding tanks and aircraft. Young men, some barely old enough to vote, lined up at recruiting offices. Driven by a sudden and unshakable sense of duty, the sleeping giant, once content to watch the world from across the seas, had awakened, and it awakened with a terrible resolve. In small towns and big cities alike, America turned its full attention to the war. its vast resources and spirit ready to be poured into the fires of conflict, battles across the globe as the months turned to years. The American presence stretched across continents and oceans. In the east, across the green fields and villages of Europe, soldiers in worn boots trudged forward under gray, endless skies. From the sands of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, each battle was a bitter struggle measured in inches. And lives, on June 6, 1944, the shores of Normandy, France, were witness to one of history's most defining moments. Under the heavy weight of the dawn, waves of American soldiers stormed the beaches, battling fierce German defenses. Machine gun fire stitched the air. Sand churned with blood and seawater. The courage of thousands paved a pathway inland, breaking Hitler's grip on Western Europe. Meanwhile, across the vast Pacific, another brutal campaign raged. From the dense jungles of Guadalcanal to the rocky cliffs of Okinawa, American forces fought a determined enemy. Battles were measured not only in victories, but in suffering the harsh terrain, the relentless fighting, and the ever-present shadow of death. Victory did not come easily. Each island taken, each town liberated, came at a terrible price. Soldiers wrote home about friends lost, about homesickness and fear, about the hope that someday soon peace might return. The world had become a battlefield, and America's sons and daughters were scattered across it, carrying with them the dreams of a world without tyranny, the Holocaust's horror as Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe. The dark secrets of the Nazi regime came into chilling light. The first camps liberated were bewildering barbed wire stretched across barren lands. Skeletal figures moved with haunted eyes, and the air hung heavy with an invisible sorrow. What was found in those places was beyond imagination. Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, names that would forever stain human history. Inside the gates, mountains of shoes, eyeglasses, and the silent remnants of millions told a story of unspeakable horror. Gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums still warm, children's toys piled beside broken suitcases, soldiers who had braved bullets and bombs broke down in tears at what they saw. The evil revealed was not just physical, but spiritual, a mass cruelty that seemed impossible in the modern world. The Holocaust's discovery changed the course of hearts as much as politics. It became clear that the war was not only about territory or survival, but about defending the very soul of humanity. For many Americans, the images from the camps etched themselves into memory. They became a solemn reminder of why the sacrifices had been necessary and why peace, when it came, would need to be carefully tended, never again to be taken for granted. Victory and atomic shadows in May 1945, the guns in Europe finally fell. Silent. Streets from New York to small prairie towns erupted in celebration. Flags waved from windows, and kisses were shared in the streets. Victory in Europe was a phrase on every tongue, a dream realized after years of struggle and loss. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. Japan's forces, though battered, refused to surrender. Plans were drawn for an invasion that promised even greater bloodshed. Then, in a decision that would forever shape the modern world, a new weapon was unleashed on August 6, 1945. the city of Hiroshima disappeared in a blinding flash. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The atomic bombs leveled entire cities. There, mushroom clouds casting long shadows across history. Tens of thousands perished instantly, and countless more suffered in the aftermath. Japan, faced with unimaginable destruction, surrendered shortly after. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the official documents were signed. World War II was over, yet the celebrations were bittersweet. Beneath the cheers, there was mourning for the lives lost, for the innocence shattered, and for the new and fearful power humanity now held in its hands. America emerged from the war a changed nation stronger, yes, but also burdened with the knowledge of what the world could become when hatred was left unchecked, and what horrors might be unleashed in the name of victory. The fires of World War II had burned fiercely, consuming the lives of millions. As the smoke cleared, it left behind a world eager for peace but scarred by the memory of what had been endured. The task ahead would be to rebuild, to heal, and to remember lest history's darkest chapters be repeated once more. Chapter 17, Cold Fronts and Red Fears. The final echoes of World War II had hardly faded when a new, quieter conflict began to shape the world. In cities like Berlin and Warsaw, a different kind of line was drawn, one not of battlefields, but of ideology. Across the heart of Europe, the Iron Curtain descended. Winston Churchill's words painted the invisible wall that split East from West. On one side, the promise of democracy and free markets. On the other, a tightening grip of communism, where freedoms grew scarce and suspicion took root. From the cold streets of Moscow to the bustling avenues of New York, the world shifted from guns and tanks to ideas and influence. In the East, the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, sought to expand its shadow. Nations like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia found themselves behind the Iron Curtain, where choices were dictated and dissent was crushed. In response, the United States embraced a new role, that of a global guardian. Aid packages like the Marshall Plan poured resources into rebuilding Western Europe, not just to heal wounds, but to fortify the continent against the spread of communism. The Cold War was not marked by open battle, at least not at first. Instead, it played out through whispers in backrooms, secret missions in distant lands, and a constant, uneasy tension that hung over the world like a heavy fog. The alliances forged and the divisions carved during these early years would set the stage for decades of rivalry, fear, and an arms race that spiraled into the skies. Korea's forgotten war in 1950, a faraway peninsula, became the flashpoint of this growing tension. Korea, divided at the 38th parallel, saw the ideologies of East and West collide in brutal, relentless combat. North Korea, backed by Soviet and Chinese forces, stormed across the border, seeking to unify the country under communism. America, along with United Nations allies, responded swiftly. Soldiers who had just returned from Europe found themselves once again marching off to war, this time into the rugged hills and frozen valleys of Korea. The Korean War was savage and punishing. Battles ebbed and flowed across the same ground, with cities changing hands multiple times. In the chilling winters, soldiers endured freezing temperatures, their boots cracking in the ice, their rifles nearly frozen in their hands. Names like Incheon and Pusan became etched into history books, though many would later call it the Forgotten War. It lacked the sweeping victories and grand conclusions that made other conflicts so vivid. Instead, it ended in a stalemate, with a fragile ceasefire signed in 1953. The two Koreas remained divided, a tense border watched by wary soldiers even. To this day, for America, the Korean War was a sobering reminder that the Cold War would not stay cold forever. Blood had already been spilled, and the world realized that ideological battles could, and would, turn into real ones, costing lives and shaping futures far beyond distant borders, suburbs, and superpowers back home. Life seemed too bloomin'. Vivid contrast to the tensions abroad. The post-war years brought an era of prosperity. Soldiers returned home, married their sweethearts, and started families. New neighborhoods, known as suburbs, sprang up almost overnight, rows of tidy houses with white picket fences, green lawns, and the steady hum of washing machines and television sets. The American dream seemed within reach for millions. Highways crisscrossed the country, connecting cities like veins carrying the lifeblood of a booming economy. Shopping malls bustled with activity. Rock and roll floated through the air, and teenagers found a voice and culture of their own. Yet beneath this glittering surface, fear simmered. In classrooms, children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks in case of nuclear attack. In living rooms, black and white televisions warned of communist spies hiding in plain sight. Neighbors watched each other with cautious eyes, and loyalty oaths became a common requirement for teachers and government workers. Senator Joseph McCarthy's crusade against alleged communists ignited a frenzy of accusations, trials, and ruined reputations. Fear became a currency as valuable as gold, traded in whispers and suspicion. Prosperity and paranoia walked hand in hand through the 1950s. As refrigerators were stocked and new cars gleamed in driveways, Americans lived with the uneasy knowledge that the world outside their neighborhoods was darker, more dangerous, and constantly teetering on the edge of conflict. The space race begins on an October evening in 1957. A tiny metallic sphere, no bigger than a beach ball, soared into the blackness above the Earth. Its name was Sputnik, and with its steady, mechanical beep, it shattered American confidence. The Soviet Union had beaten the United States into space. That faint signal drifting down from the heavens seemed to echo with a new, chilling reality. If they could launch a satellite, what else could they send over American skies? The space race had begun, not just as a contest of technology, but as a battle of ideologies. Space became the newest frontier, where freedom and communism would vie for supremacy. America responded with urgency. Schools intensified science and math programs. New agencies like NASA were born overnight. Engineers, scientists, and dreamers pushed the boundaries of possibility, racing not just for pride, but for survival, for children lying in their beds at night, gazing up at the stars. The sky no longer seemed so vast or so safe. It was a place of wonder and of worry. The launching of Sputnik didn't just launch a satellite. It launched a new chapter of the Cold War, one that would eventually take humanity all the way to the moon. But in these early days, it was a sharp reminder that the battle for the future was no longer limited to the ground below. It now reached into the endless, silent deep above. Chapter 18. America Today and Tomorrow. In the early years of the new century, American soldiers found themselves once again crossing oceans, stepping into unfamiliar sands and ancient cities. After the heartbreak of September 11th, the nation moved swiftly into action, seeking to dismantle the threats that had so violently pierced its sense of safety. Afghanistan was first, its rugged mountains and winding valleys swallowing battalions whole into a conflict with no clear end. Iraq soon followed, under the heavy banners of preemptive defense and the hope of spreading democracy. But war, once begun, seldom obeys its first intentions. What seemed at first a swift and decisive campaign stretched into years, and then into decades. Towns were cleared, only to be retaken. Victories proclaimed, only to fade into uncertainty for many young Americans. War became not a singular event, but the background hum of their entire lives. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, deployed again and again. Weddings, births, and funerals passed without them. The deserts of the Middle East drank American hopes. Dreams of swift victory gave way to the heavy reality of rebuilding shattered. Nations of fighting enemies who wore no uniforms, and of coming home to a country that struggled to understand the cost of endless war. Across living rooms, folded flags replaced missing loved ones. And for those who returned, the battles often continued quieter, invisible, but no less real. The scars of war, both on the landscape abroad and the hearts at home, would linger long after the last shots were fired, dreams deferred and reclaimed even as distant wars raged. A different kind of battle stirred within the cities and neighborhoods of America. Voices that had long been silenced began once more to rise, calling for justice, for equality, for the fulfillment of promises too often delayed. In the warm nights of Ferguson, in the crowded streets of Baltimore, in countless marches, across bridges and boulevards, a new generation picked up the ancient banners of protest. Black Lives Matter became not just a movement but a mirror, reflecting back a painful truth that the dream of America remained unfinished, still out of reach for many. Women raised their voices too, from Hollywood studios to factory floors, breaking the long silence of harassment and inequality. The #MeToo movement swept across industries, calling out old wrongs and demanding a future built on respect and dignity. Immigrants, too, faced new battles. Families were separated at borders. Dreams once nurtured under the wide sky of opportunity felt increasingly fragile, battered by waves of fear and division. Yet amid the pain, there was also power. New leaders rose from unexpected places. New laws were written. New coalitions formed, crossing old lines of race, gender, and age. The American dream had never been a guarantee. It was a struggle daily, messy, exhausting, but it was still alive, carried in the hearts of millions who refused to give up, who believed that the country's best days could still lie ahead, if only the work was done. A divided house as movements surged and wars dragged on. The political fabric of America began to fray. What had once been spirited debate hardened into bitter, unyielding divisions. cable news split into camps. Social media amplified every grievance, every outrage, every suspicion. Neighborhoods once tied together by little league games and church. Potlucks grew wary and distant. Faith and fear became powerful forces. Some clung tighter to old traditions, believing they were under siege. Others demanded sweeping change, impatient with the slow pace of progress. Elections became battlegrounds not just of ideas, but of identity. Families sat at Thanksgiving tables, carefully avoiding subjects that could ignite old wounds. Friendships crumbled under the weight of opposing yard signs. The Capitol itself, once a symbol of the people's will, became a fortress surrounded by fences and doubt. January 6, 2021, saw its halls overrun, a moment of violence and anger that stunned even the most cynical observers. It seemed, at times, that the nation might tear itself apart, not through war or invasion, but through distrust, misinformation, and a growing inability to see one another's humanity. Yet even in the darkest hours, the American experiment, fragile and battered, endured. The system bent, but did not break. Voters lined up. Courts ruled. Communities rebuilt. Somewhere beneath the noise, the old, stubborn hope that had carried generations before still flickered, the eternal experiment through every war, every movement, every election. America has been and remains an experiment, a gamble on. The idea that a diverse, restless, imperfect people could govern themselves, striving always toward a more perfect union. It was never meant to be easy. The founders themselves argued bitterly, compromised painfully, and doubted their success even as they penned their hopes onto parchment. Today, that experiment continues. In classrooms where young children of every race recite the same pledge. In courtrooms where justice is argued fiercely. In protests and in prayers, in ballot boxes and in boardrooms, in the small kindnesses shared between strangers, technology races forward, blurring borders and bending reality. Climate change threatens coastlines and crops. Global pandemics remind the nation of its vulnerability and its interconnectedness. New challenges loom, as daunting as any faced before. Yet there is something enduring, something quietly magnificent in America's constant wrestling with itself, its refusal to accept that it has already arrived at its best self. The story of America is not a finished book. It is an unfinished symphony, a canvas still wet with paint, a dream still being chased across amber fields and city streets. Tomorrow's chapters will be written by hands not yet born, shaped by struggles not yet imagined. And though the journey is long and often painful, the promise remains that out of the many, one might still rise imperfect, striving, ever hopeful. As night falls over the vast, varied landscape of America, one truth echoes through the valleys. And across the plains, the American story is not over. It was never meant to be.